It was one of those paths everyone in the neighborhood knew but never talked about. A cracked, forgotten strip of asphalt wending through the woods, flanked by moss-covered stones and the rusting skeletons of old cars. For most kids, it was just a shortcut, a way to shave 20 minutes off the walk to school or get to the lake faster in summer. For Danny and me, it was more. It was the place where we told each other secrets, dared each other to be braver than we were, and occasionally scared the hell out of each other with stories that no adult could ever confirm or deny. But nothing we'd imagined could have prepared us for what we found there. The first time I heard about the Riddle House, it was Danny who brought it up. That wasn't unusual. Danny always had a story. He was the kind of kid who could turn a trip to the corner store into an epic saga of close calls and near disasters. It was late September, and the air had just started to cool, the woods around us alive with the smell of damp earth and fallen leaves. We were walking the path home after school, the kind of golden afternoon where the world felt infinite, and the only thing that mattered was squeezing as much adventure as possible out of the dying light. "You ever hear about the house at the end of this road?" Danny asked, kicking a rock that skittered off into the trees. I glanced at him, already worried. "What house?" "The Riddle House," he said, his voice dipping into that low conspiratorial tone he used when he was about to tell a ghost story. "It's old, like ancient, way older than anything else around here. Nobody lives there now, but people say it belonged to a guy named Grayson. He was a weirdo, always building stuff out in the woods. One day, he just vanished." "Vanished," I echoed, trying to sound unimpressed. Danny nodded, his grin widening. "Poof, gone. Last anyone saw him, he was standing on his porch, ranting about how they were coming for him. Then one night, his house just..." Danny made a sweeping motion with his hands, like a magician revealing an empty hat. I rolled my eyes. "And let me guess, nobody's been there since." "People tried," Danny said, "but weird stuff always happened. Doors that wouldn't open, windows that looked out into places that weren't there. My brother's friend said he went once and heard voices whispering his name. He ran out so fast, he tripped and broke his nose." I tried to laugh, but the sound came out brittle. "Your brother's friend probably made that up." "Yeah." Danny stopped walking and turned to me, his eyes gleaming with a challenge. "Then let's go see for ourselves." That was Danny for you, always pushing, always daring. And me, I hated being the cautious one. I didn't want to look scared, especially not in front of him. So I shrugged, shoved my hands into my hoodie pocket and muttered, "Fine, lead the way." The road stretched on darker and narrower the farther we went. The trees grew thicker, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blotted out the setting sun. The air changed too. Colder, heavier, like we'd stepped into a different world. Even the sounds were wrong. No birdsong, no rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. Just the crunch of our sneakers on gravel and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. We didn't talk much after that. Danny, who could usually fill any silence with chatter, was uncharacteristically quiet. And then there it was. The Riddle House. It stood at the end of the road like it had been waiting for us. A sagging two-story structure with peeling paint the color of dirty dishwater. The windows were boarded up, but the gaps between the slats seemed to glow faintly, like there was something alive inside, breathing light. The roof was caved in on one side, and the porch leaned so far forward, it looked like it might collapse if you so much as sneezed. But what struck me most wasn't how old or broken it was. It was how out of place it felt, like the house didn't belong here. Or maybe like it had been dropped here by mistake. "Creepy," Danny whispered, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. We stood there for a long time staring at the house. The sun had almost set, and the shadows seemed to pool around it, deep and unmoving. For a moment, I thought I saw something shift in one of the upstairs windows, a flicker of movement, quick as a blink. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Danny didn't answer. He was already moving, his feet crunching softly on the gravel as he started toward the house. "Wait, Danny," I hissed, but he didn't stop. I followed, more out of fear of being left behind than any real courage. The closer we got, the colder the air became, until I could see my breath clouding in front of me. When we reached the porch, Danny stopped and looked back at me, his grin reappearing. Last chance to chicken out. I glared at him, though my hands were trembling. "Just open the door." Danny reached for the handle, but before he could touch it, a sound stopped us both cold, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming on wood. It was coming from inside the house. The sound of tapping froze us in place. Danny's hand hovered inches from the door handle, his cocky grin now stretched tight with uncertainty. It wasn't loud, just faint enough to make you wonder if you'd imagined it, but it was there. A steady, deliberate rhythm, like someone or something was waiting on the other side. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Danny nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. "Probably just the wind. Wind doesn't knock." "Maybe it's an animal, then," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. I didn't believe him, and I don't think he believed himself. Still, I wasn't about to back down, not when we were already here, not when I could practically feel the house daring us to come inside. Danny turned the handle, the door creaking open with a groan that sounded almost alive. I don't know what I expected to see, cobwebs, broken furniture, maybe a family of raccoons, but it wasn't that. The inside of the house was immaculate. The floorboards gleamed like they'd just been polished. The walls were bare but smooth, free of dust or grime. A staircase wound upward into the darkness, its banister carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when I looked at them too long. It was wrong. Not because it was clean, but because it was clean here. In a house no one had lived in for decades. A house that looked like it should have crumbled to dust the moment we stepped inside. "Whoa," Danny breathed, stepping over the threshold. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to stay outside. But Danny was already inside, his footsteps echoing softly against the floorboards, and I couldn't let him face whatever this was alone. The air inside was colder, heavier, like stepping into a freezer. My breath fogged in front of me, and I rubbed my arms to chase away the goosebumps spreading over my skin. "Look at this place." Danny's voice hushed. "It's like brand new." "Too new," I muttered. The tapping sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was upstairs. Danny and I exchanged a look, the unspoken challenge passing between us. He started toward the staircase, and I followed, every creak of the steps making my stomach tighten. The upstairs was darker, the air thicker, and I swear I could feel the house breathing around me. The tapping led us to a door at the end of the hall. It was plain, unremarkable, except for the fact that it was locked. Danny jiggled the handle, then pounded on the wood with his fist. "Hello, anyone in there? Stop." The door swung open on its own, cutting off my words. I expected a room. A bedroom, maybe, or a closet. What I got was nothing. Just an empty black void, stretching endlessly in every direction. It wasn't like looking into a dark room. It was like looking into the absence of light itself, a swirling, inky blackness that seemed to move when you weren't watching. What the hell? Danny stepped closer, his hand reaching out like he wanted to touch it. I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. The tapping sound came again, louder and more frantic, and this time it was accompanied by something else, a whisper. It wasn't words exactly, more like the echo of words, garbled and broken, coming from deep inside the void. "Do you hear?" he whispered. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. The whispering grew louder, the cadence sharp and urgent, like it was calling to us. Then, for the briefest moment, I saw something move in the darkness, a face. No, not a face. The suggestion of a face, eyes that burn like embers. A mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin, teeth too perfect, too white, and behind it colors. Swirling, shifting colors that seemed to pulse and breathe, like oil slicks under sunlight. I stumbled back, my pulse hammering in my ears. "We need to go." Danny didn't move. He was staring into the void, his face pale and slack, like he couldn't look away. "Denny." I grabbed his arm, shaking him hard. "We have to get out of here." Finally, he blinked, snapping out of whatever trance the darkness had put him in. Together we turned and bolted back down the stairs, our footsteps thundering like gunshots in the silence. The house didn't want us to leave. The air seemed to thicken, dragging at my limbs with invisible hands. The walls groaned, the floorboards buckled, and the door we'd come through, slammed shut in front of us. Danny reached it first, yanking at the handle with all his strength. "It's locked." "Keep trying," I shouted, my voice cracking with panic. The tapping sound was everywhere now, pounding like a heartbeat. The whispers turned to laughter, high-pitched, manic laughter that echoed through the house, growing louder and louder until it was all I could hear. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The door flew open, and Danny and I tumbled outside, gasping for air. We didn't stop running until we reached the main road, the house fading into the distance behind us. Neither of us spoke. What could we say? That the house had come alive, that something in there had looked at us, had reached for us. Danny broke the silence first, his voice shaking. "We're not going back." I nodded, my hands trembling. "Never." But the house wasn't done with us. When I got home, I found something waiting for me. A single, perfectly white tooth, sitting on my windowsill. I didn't sleep that night. The tooth sat on my window, gleaming like bone in the pale moonlight, its presence taunting me. I thought about throwing it away, hurling it into the woods or burying it deep where it couldn't find me. But something told me it wouldn't matter. The house wasn't done with me, and no amount of running would change that. Danny didn't text. He didn't call. That wasn't like him. Normally, we'd spend hours on the phone dissecting every weird thing we'd seen, but the silence stretched between us like a wall. A heavy, suffocating silence that made the air in my room feel thick and stale. When morning came, I couldn't stand it anymore. I needed to see him. Danny's house was only a few blocks away, but the walk felt endless. The streets, usually buzzing with the sounds of lawnmowers and kids on bikes, were eerily quiet. Even the birds seemed to have gone still. When I got to Danny's house, his mom answered the door. She smiled at me, but her eyes were tired. "Oh hey, Danny's not feeling great today. He's been in his room all morning. Can I see him?" I asked, my voice cracking. She hesitated, then stepped aside. "Just for a little while, okay? He's been acting strange." That didn't sit right with me. Danny wasn't the type to get sick, and he definitely wasn't the type to act strange. I nodded and slipped past her, my stomach tightening as I climbed the stairs to his room. I knocked once before pushing the door open. Danny was sitting on his bed, staring out the window. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and his hands trembled in his lap. He didn't look at me when I came in. "Danny," I said softly. His head snapped toward me, and for a moment I didn't recognize him. His expression was wild, panicked, like he was trapped in some nightmare he couldn't wake from. "They followed me," he whispered. "What?" "The house," he said, his voice trembling. "It's not just a house. It's them. They live in it. They are it." I took a step closer, my heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" Danny shook his head, his fingers digging into his thighs. "I saw them, in my dreams. Everywhere I look, I see them. They're smiling, always smiling." A chill ran down my spine. "Danny, you're not making sense." "I can't stop them," he shouted, his voice cracking. "They're already here, they've always been here." I froze. He wasn't just scared, he was terrified, and I knew deep down that he wasn't lying. Danny's mom called up the stairs, her voice soft but strained. "Everything okay up there?" I forced myself to answer. "Yeah, we're fine." But we weren't fine, not even close. I stayed with Danny for hours, trying to make sense of his rambling. He talked about the house, about the figures in the void, about something he called the grin. He said they were coming, that they were already here, hiding in plain sight. "They wear faces," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They look like people, but they're not. You can tell by their eyes. And their teeth, too white, too sharp. And when they smile, you'll know." I didn't want to believe him. I couldn't believe him. But when I left his house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next night, I woke to the sound of tapping. It was faint at first, a soft, rhythmic knock that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and that's when I saw it. The tooth. It wasn't on the windowsill anymore. It was on my nightstand, sitting there like it had been placed deliberately. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it wasn't just one sound. It was a chorus, 1,000 fingers drumming in perfect unison. I turned toward the window, and my blood turned to ice. The house was back. It stood where it always had, its windows glowing faintly, its door wide open. And standing in the doorway was a figure. It was tall and thin, its skin a shifting mass of colors that seemed to bleed into one another. Its face was smooth and featureless, except for its mouth, a wide, impossibly sharp grin that stretched ear to ear. It raised a hand, its fingers long and clawed, and pointed directly at me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as it stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. And then, just as it reached the edge of the field, it stopped. The grin widened, and it whispered my name. That was the last time I saw the house. Danny stopped coming to school after that. His mom said he'd gone to stay with relatives, but I didn't believe her. I tried calling, texting, even riding my bike to his house, but it was like he'd vanished. And the tooth, it disappeared the next day, leaving no trace behind. But I know the house is still out there, waiting, watching. Sometimes, late at night, I hear tapping at my window, and when I close my eyes, I see the grin.